They told Eleanor Whitfield it was for her own good. They told her the house was too much upkeep, that a woman of 78 had no business living alone on 40 acres. So while she was recovering in a hospital bed, her 3 children signed the papers, sold the farmhouse, split the money 3 ways. But there was one thing on that land they never once thought to check. An old well, capped in concrete, that her husband sealed the week before he died. Hello, friends, and welcome back. If this is your first time joining us here, I want to say, pull up a chair, get comfortable, maybe grab your coffee, because today's story is one of those ones. You know the kind. The kind where you're going to feel your blood pressure rise a little around the middle. And then, if you stick with me all the way to the end, you're going to feel something settle back down into place. Like justice does that sometimes. Quietly, in its own time. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who believes that family means something, that a mother who raised you, fed you, sat up nights with you when you were sick, deserves better than what she's often given in her later years, then hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you're the kind of audience I love making these stories for. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, because we've got a new story every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens in this one. All right, let's get into it. Eleanor Whitfield was born in 1947 in a little farmhouse outside a town in central Ohio called Millbrook Junction, the kind of town that's small enough that everybody at the diner knows your name, and small enough that everybody also knows your business, whether you like it or not. She was the third of 5 children, raised by parents who didn't have much money, but had more pride and more grit than most people you'll ever meet. Her father worked the land. Her mother canned vegetables every fall like it was a religious ceremony, and in a way, out there, it kind of was. Eleanor met Frank Whitfield at a county fair when she was 19 years old. He was tall, a little awkward, and, by every account anyone in that town will still give you today, 60 years later, utterly, hopelessly devoted to her from the very first conversation they had standing next to a funnel cake stand. Now, I want you to really sit with that for a second, because this is important for what comes later in the story. Frank and Eleanor didn't have a whirlwind romance built on money or status. They built something slow, something real. They got married in 1967, and Frank, who'd inherited a piece of land from his own father, took that land and built a farmhouse on it with his own 2 hands, board by board, nail by nail, over the course of 3 years. That farmhouse is where they raised 3 children: Richard, born in 1969, Denise, born in 1971, and Michael, the baby of the family, born in 1975. For over 50 years, that farmhouse was the center of everything. Christmas mornings, 4th of July barbecues where half the town would show up because Eleanor made a potato salad that people still talk about. Sunday dinners that never once, not one single Sunday in 50 years, got canceled because Eleanor believed, fiercely, that family showing up for each other was the whole entire point of having one. Frank passed away in 2019. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. And here's something you need to remember, because it matters later. In the weeks before he died, Frank did something a little unusual. He spent an entire weekend out by the old well on the property, the one that had been capped off and in use since they'd put in modern plumbing back in the 80s. Eleanor asked him what he was doing out there. Just making sure everything's sealed up right, he told her. Never know. She thought it was one of those strange little projects men do when they're getting older, fixing things that don't necessarily need fixing just to feel useful. She didn't think much more of it. And honestly, friends, if you've been married a long time, or if you were, you probably know exactly the kind of moment I'm describing. There's a particular quiet that settles over a long marriage, a shorthand, an unspoken trust that lets one partner putter around with a project without the other one needing every detail explained. Eleanor had that kind of trust in Frank. 52 years of it. So when he spent a Saturday and a Sunday out by that old well with a bag of quick-set concrete and a look on his face she couldn't quite read, she brought him iced tea around 4 o'clock, same as she always did, and let him be. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until much later, was that Frank had been carrying a quiet worry in his chest for the better part of 2 years. Not about his health, though his heart, it would turn out, was already beginning to fail him in ways no one could see. His worry was about the people they had raised, about what kind of family Richard, Denise, and Michael had actually grown into, versus the family Frank and Eleanor had always assumed they were raising. Frank never said any of this out loud, not fully, not even to Eleanor. That was his way, a quiet man who dealt with worry through action rather than conversation. He'd grown up on that same land, watched his own father work himself into the ground for children who, by the time he passed, barely came around anymore. Frank had promised himself, somewhere along the way, that if he ever saw the same pattern forming in his own family, he wouldn't just watch it happen. Until years later, when it would end up matching more than anything else in this entire story. Now stay with me here, because I promise you, everything I'm telling you right now is going to come back around by the end of this video. And when it does, you are going to want to have remembered every single detail. Let's talk about Richard, Denise, and Michael. Because in stories like this one, it's easy to paint children as simply the bad guys, but I think it's more honest and frankly more useful for all of us watching to understand exactly how people get to a place where they can do what these three did to their own mother. Richard, the eldest, was 55 years old at the time our story really kicks off. He'd had, by most outward measures, a comfortable life. A job in regional sales that had been restructuring him out of promotions for a few years, a mortgage that was a little too big for his salary, and 2 kids in college racking up the kind of debt that keeps a parent up at night doing math in their head at 2 a.m. Denise, 53, was a woman who, and I say this gently, had spent much of her adult life measuring her worth against her friends' Facebook posts. New kitchen renovations, vacations to Cancun, a husband, Gary, who worked in what he called investments, and who Eleanor, privately, never fully trusted. And Michael, the youngest at 49, was the one who, if you'd asked anyone in Millbrook Junction, seemed the most likely to do right by his mother. He'd stayed local. He visited more than his siblings. He mowed Eleanor's lawn some Saturdays. People genuinely believed Michael was the good one. I want you to remember that too. Now here's where things start to shift. In the spring of that year, Eleanor, then 78, took a fall in her kitchen, slipped on a wet floor, broke her hip. It happens to so many of us, or someone we love, as the years go on. And if you're watching this and you've been through something similar with a parent, I want you to know you are not alone, and I see you. She was hospitalized for 11 days, then transferred to a rehabilitation facility for what doctors said would likely be 6 to 8 weeks of recovery. And that is exactly when it started. While Eleanor lay in a hospital bed, unable to walk, unable to drive to the bank or sign documents in person, unable to do much of anything except worry about her own recovery, her 3 children sat down together, in her own kitchen, without her. Richard had power of attorney. Eleanor had set that up years earlier, back when Frank first passed, thinking of it as a simple safety net, something practical, something responsible, never imagining it would become the exact instrument used against her. The conversation, according to what a family friend later pieced together, went something like this. The farmhouse and the 40 acres around it were worth, by conservative estimate, around $420,000. Eleanor's rehab and potential long-term care, if she needed it, was going to be expensive. Rather than burden their mother with decisions during her recovery, the three of them decided they would help by handling things themselves. They contacted a realtor within 9 days of Eleanor's hospitalization. 9 days, friends. Her hip wasn't even fully set in the cast, and there was already a for sale sign being ordered for the lawn she'd tended for over 50 years. Now, I want to be fair here, because a good story deserves fairness, even toward the people doing wrong in it. Richard would later claim, and genuinely seemed to believe, that selling the home and moving Eleanor into a modest assisted living facility was a responsible decision. That an elderly widow living alone on 40 acres, with a hip that would never be quite the same, was a genuine safety risk. There is a version of this decision that could have been made with love, with Eleanor in the room, with her voice in it. That is not what happened. The three siblings toured exactly one assisted living facility. Not the nicest one in the county, not even a mid-tier one, but a place called Cedar Grove Manor, chosen specifically, court records would later reveal, because it was the cheapest option that would still accept Medicaid patients within a 50-mile radius. Why does that detail matter? Because the difference between Cedar Grove Manor and the nicer facility 12 miles away came out to almost $1,100 a month. $1,100 a month, multiplied out over what they assumed would be the remaining years of their mother's life, was money that, instead of paying for her comfort, would instead sit in a joint account the three of them controlled. The house sold in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. For a home that took 3 years to build and 52 years to fill with an entire family's worth of memories. Eleanor found out it had sold the day she was being discharged from rehab. Not before. Not during. The day of. Denise was the one who told her, in the hallway of the rehabilitation facility, holding a clipboard with Cedar Grove Manor's intake paperwork already filled out. "Mom, we didn't want to stress you out while you were healing," Denise said. "We took care of everything." And Eleanor, 78 years old, still using a walker, still in genuine physical pain, sat there in that hallway and absorbed the fact that the only home she had left in this world, the home her husband built board by board with his own hands, was already gone. Sold. Signed away. And she had never once been asked. Now, friends, I want to ask you something, and I really do want you to answer this down in the comments, because I read every single one of them. Have you ever had a moment, with your own children, or perhaps you witnessed it happen to a friend's parent, where a decision that should have included you was made entirely without you? Type "silenced" in the comments if this hits close to home. I have a feeling I'm going to see that word a lot today. Cedar Grove Manor was not a bad place, exactly. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't neglectful in any way that would show up in a state inspection report. But it was, in every sense that mattered to a woman who had spent her whole life surrounded by wide open land, wildflowers in the spring, and a porch that faced the sunset, a cage. A small, beige, fluorescent-lit cage with a shared bathroom, and a roommate named Doris who kept the television on at full volume from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. Eleanor didn't complain. That wasn't her way. Frank used to say she had more backbone than any three men he'd ever met. And that backbone showed itself now not in fighting back, but in quiet, dignified endurance. Her days there settled into a rhythm that had almost nothing in common with 50 years on the farm. Breakfast at 7, in a dining hall that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A morning activity, bingo some days, a seated stretching class other days, led by a cheerful young aide named Kayla whom Eleanor genuinely grew fond of. Lunch at noon. A long, quiet afternoon. Dinner at 5:30, early enough that by the hour the sun actually started to set, the exact hour Eleanor used to sit on her porch with Frank, watching the light change over the fields, she was already back in her room, listening to Doris's television through the thin wall between their beds. If you've ever had a parent or a grandparent move into a place like Cedar Grove, you know it isn't usually the big things that wear a person down. It's the small ones. Not choosing what time you eat. Not having a door you can close all the way for real privacy. Not having a single window that shows you the particular patch of sky you spent half a century learning by heart. She wrote in a small notebook every day, a habit she'd kept since she was a girl. And in the weeks after the move, her entries, which a close friend named Margaret would later be allowed to read, took on a tone that broke Margaret's heart. One entry read, "The room here doesn't have a window I can see the sky from properly. I miss the well. I miss the way the light hit the yard in the evening. I keep thinking about what Frank buried out there, and whether it will matter to anyone now that the land isn't ours anymore." Now, did you catch that? What Frank buried out there. Hold on to that thread, friends, because we are getting close now to the heart of this story. Margaret, Eleanor's closest friend for over 40 years, was one of the only people who visited Cedar Grove Manor regularly. Richard visited twice a month, mostly on his way to somewhere else. Denise visited even less, usually with some excuse about her husband's business trips or her kids' school events. Michael, the good one, remember, visited most often out of the three, but even his visits had a transactional edge to them now. He'd stop by, ask if she needed anything, and leave within 20 minutes. Margaret, on the other hand, came every single Tuesday and Thursday, brought Eleanor's favorite lemon bars from the bakery downtown, and sat with her for hours listening to stories about Frank, about the farmhouse, about a life that had been, by any measure, well and fully lived, right up until the ending that had been written for her by other people. It was on one of these visits, about 4 months after the move, that Eleanor finally told Margaret the truth about the well. "Margaret," Eleanor said one Thursday afternoon, her voice quieter than usual, "I need to tell someone something, in case I don't get the chance later." Margaret, sensing the weight in her friend's tone, set down the lemon bars and gave Eleanor her full attention. "You remember the old well? The one Frank capped off years ago, right before he passed?" Margaret nodded. "He didn't just seal it for safety," Eleanor said. "There's a box down there. A metal lockbox, waterproofed, wrapped in plastic sheeting, sitting on a concrete shelf about 8 feet down, above the water line. Frank built it in special, the same weekend he resealed the whole thing. Now here is where I need you to lean in a little closer, because what Eleanor told Margaret next is the entire reason we're all here today. Inside that box, Eleanor explained, was a collection that Frank had been quietly building for almost 30 years, silver dollars, mostly pre-1965, the kind with real silver content, along with a small number of gold coins Frank had purchased slowly over the decades, a little at a time, from a coin dealer 2 counties over, always paying cash, always keeping it separate from any bank account or tax record that his children or anyone else might ever stumble across. Frank Whitfield had never trusted banks the way some men of his generation didn't, not fully. But more than that, and this is the part Eleanor admitted with real sadness in her voice, Frank had, in his final years, started to notice things about their children that troubled him deeply. He noticed how Richard talked about when we inherit the place at Thanksgiving dinners, as though it were already decided, already owed to him. He noticed how Denise's husband Gary had, on more than one occasion, asked pointed questions about the farmhouse's estimated value, and about whether Eleanor and Frank had done any estate planning yet. And even Michael, sweet, dependable Michael, had once, after a few beers at a family barbecue, joked about how he hoped his mother didn't waste it all on some fancy nursing home before he got his share. Frank never said anything to his children about what he'd noticed. That wasn't his way either. But he came home from that barbecue, and the following weekend, he went out to the well. He told me, Eleanor said to Margaret, her eyes wet, that if our children ever showed him, really showed him, not just said the right words, but showed him with their actions, that they cared more about what we had than about who we were, then that box wasn't for them. He said if that day came, I'd know what to do. And did he tell you what that was? Margaret asked gently. Eleanor reached into the small drawer of her nightstand at Cedar Grove Manor and pulled out a folded, yellowed envelope. On the front, in Frank's unmistakable handwriting, it read, "To be opened only if our children choose money over their mother." Friends, I want you to sit with that phrase for just a moment. If our children choose money over their mother. Frank Whitfield, in his final months on this earth, loved his wife enough and understood his children clearly enough to prepare for exactly the situation she now found herself living inside. Now, before we find out exactly what was in that envelope and exactly what happens next in this story, because trust me, what's coming is going to make you want to stand up and cheer, I want to pause for just a moment. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take 2 seconds to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people just like you. People who appreciate a story with heart, with justice, and with a little bit of old-fashioned truth to it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and ring that little bell so you never miss one of these stories. We post every single week, and I promise you, we've got more coming that are just as good, if not better, than this one. All right, let's get back to it. Because things are about to change for Eleanor Whitfield, in a way absolutely nobody in that family saw coming. Now let's shift our attention for a moment, because there's another piece of this story that matters just as much as anything happening to Eleanor herself. The farmhouse and the 40 acres had been purchased by a young couple named Tom and Sarah Reyes. Tom worked as an electrician. Sarah had just gone part-time at her job as a physical therapist assistant to prepare for their first baby, due that coming winter. They'd been searching for almost 2 years for a piece of property exactly like this one. Enough land for a garden, enough character in the house to make it feel like a home rather than just a structure, and, crucially, a price that a young working family could actually afford. They fell in love with the farmhouse the moment they walked through the front door. Sarah would later say she felt an odd, warm sense of this house has been loved the second she stepped inside, a feeling she couldn't quite explain, but one she trusted. What neither Tom nor Sarah knew, of course, was any of the history we've just walked through together. To them, this was simply a dream coming true, their first home, a fresh start, a place to raise their child. They did notice a few small things during the walkthrough, the kind of details that only make sense in hindsight. A faint outline in the hallway wall where a family photo had clearly hung for decades, the paint around it slightly less faded than the rest. Pencil marks on the doorframe of what must have been a child's bedroom, tracking heights from what looked like 1970-something all the way up through the early 90s. 3 different sets of initials, climbing the frame year after year. Sarah ran her fingers over those marks the day they got the keys and felt, she said later, an odd responsibility settle over her, like she'd inherited not just a house, but a duty to be gentle with whatever had happened inside it. Neither of them could have imagined just how much that instinct would matter. About 5 months after moving in, Tom decided to tackle a project he'd been putting off, dealing with some standing water and drainage issues near an old capped well at the edge of the property. His plan was simple: dig around the cap, check the seal, make sure nothing was cracked or letting groundwater seep where it shouldn't. What Tom found instead, about 3 feet down, was something that made him stop digging immediately and call Sarah outside. Embedded in the concrete cap, clearly placed there deliberately rather than randomly, was a small waterproof tube, the kind hunters used to keep matches dry, sealed with wax, and inside it, a single folded piece of paper. The note read simply, "If you are reading this, you are not the family this well was meant for. Please, before you go any further, call this number and ask for Harold Bennett, attorney at law, Millbrook Junction. Tell him the well has been found." Tom and Sarah looked at each other for a long moment. Then Tom pulled out his phone. Harold Bennett had been Frank and Eleanor Whitfield's attorney for almost 30 years, a soft-spoken, meticulous man in his early 70s himself now, the kind of small-town lawyer who still believed that his job was about people first, paperwork second. When Tom Reyes called his office and explained what he'd found, Harold Bennett went very quiet on the other end of the line. "I need you to not disturb anything further," Harold finally said. "And I need you to give me a day to make a phone call myself, before anyone touches that well again." That phone call was to Eleanor. Harold drove out to Cedar Grove Manor himself that same afternoon, something he almost never did, preferring clients come to his office. He sat down across from Eleanor in the small common room, and he told her, gently, that the well had been found by the new owners. Eleanor's hands, Margaret would later say, because Margaret happened to be visiting that same day and was present for this exact conversation, began to shake. Not from fear, from something closer to relief, mixed with a grief so old it had almost become part of her skeleton. "It's time, then," Eleanor said quietly. Now here's what almost none of the people in this story yet understood. Not Richard, not Denise, not Michael, not even Tom and Sarah Reyes standing in their own backyard with a metal detector and a growing sense that they'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a drainage problem. Frank Whitfield hadn't just hidden a box of coins in that well. He had, working quietly with Harold Bennett over the final 18 months of his life, established something much more significant, an irrevocable trust funded by the eventual sale of those coins, along with a separate life insurance policy Frank had taken out decades earlier and never once mentioned to his children. A policy worth $240,000, which had been sitting, accruing value, completely unknown to Richard, Denise, or Michael. The trust had one condition written into it, in language so plain that no lawyer could ever twist its meaning. The funds would go, in full, to whichever of Frank and Eleanor's children demonstrated, through documented, consistent care and presence during Eleanor's final years, that they had shown up for their mother the way a family is supposed to show up for each other. If none of them did, the entire trust, coins, and insurance money together, worth in total just over $310,000, would go instead to the Millbrook Junction Community Foundation to fund a scholarship in Frank and Eleanor Whitfield's names for local kids who wanted to go to college but couldn't otherwise afford it. Harold Bennett had been quietly documenting, for years, exactly how often each of the 3 children visited, called, and involved themselves in Eleanor's care, because Frank, before he passed, had asked him to. And now, with the well discovered and the trust triggered, it was time for Harold to present his findings. Harold Bennett called a meeting. Richard, Denise, and Michael were all told only that it concerned an update to their late father's estate. Nothing more. All 3 arrived at Harold's small office in downtown Millbrook Junction with the same quiet, barely concealed anticipation of people who believe good news is coming their way. Eleanor was there too, wheeled in by an aide from Cedar Grove Manor, sitting quietly at the head of the small conference table. Margaret sat beside her, holding her hand. Harold began by explaining the existence of the trust. He watched 3 sets of eyes light up with the exact same expression, the expression of people doing quick mental math about what an unexpected inheritance might mean for a mortgage, a marriage strained by money, a comfortable retirement finally within reach. Then Harold explained the condition. The room went very quiet. Based on documented visitation logs, phone records subpoenaed with Eleanor's consent, and statements from Cedar Grove Manor staff, Harold said, his voice steady and without judgment, "I'm going to walk through what the last year and a half has actually looked like." Richard had visited Eleanor 11 times in 18 months. Total time spent, approximately 6 hours. Denise had visited 7 times. Total time spent, just under 4 hours. Michael, the good one, had visited the most frequently, 23 times. But Harold's careful documentation, cross-referenced with staff logs, revealed something Eleanor herself had never mentioned to anyone. Of those 23 visits, the average length was 14 minutes. Several of them, staff logs confirmed, coincided suspiciously with days Michael needed his mother to sign something. A cosign on a loan application he'd later withdrawn, a request to be added to a different account. None of the 3 children, in 18 months, had taken Eleanor out of the facility for a single meal. None had brought her to see the farmhouse, not even to sit in the car outside and look at it, though all 3 had driven past it regularly. None had asked her a single question, according to staff logs and Margaret's own testimony, about how she was actually doing. Not the polite, "How are you?" but the real question, the one that means something. Margaret, by comparison, had visited 86 times in that same 18-month period. "Margaret isn't blood," Harold said quietly. "And I want to be clear, the trust condition was written by Frank specifically around family, around his children. But I want the record to show that the reason we know exactly how little presence Eleanor had from her own children is because someone who loved her without any financial stake in the outcome was there to notice the difference." Now, friends, I have to ask you, down in the comments, do you have a Margaret in your life? Someone who isn't blood family, but who has shown up for you, or for someone you love, more faithfully than actual relatives ever did? Type "true family" below if you've got someone like that in your corner. I want to see how many of you do, because I have a feeling it's more of you than you'd think. Richard was the first to speak after the numbers were laid bare on the table. "This isn't fair," he said. "We were busy. We have jobs, families, our own kids to worry about. Nobody has time to visit a nursing home every week. Harold, calm as ever, simply slid a folder across the table. Inside was a printed calendar, the same 18-month window, with Margaret's 86 visits marked in one color, and the children's combined 41 visits marked in another. Margaret worked full-time too. Margaret had grandchildren of her own. Margaret simply made a different choice, week after week, about where her time went. Denise began to cry, though whether from grief over her mother or grief over the money now slipping through her fingers, nobody in that room, including Eleanor, could say for certain. Michael sat very still and then asked the question that, more than anything else spoken that day, revealed exactly who he had become. Is there any way to appeal this? Any way to still qualify? Eleanor, who had been quiet through nearly the entire meeting, finally spoke. "Michael," she said, her voice not angry, but unbearably tired. "Your father asked me, before he died, whether I thought you three would show up for me the way I showed up for my own mother when she got old. I told him yes. I told him I believed in you." She paused, and Margaret squeezed her hand. "I was wrong. And I think, somewhere in yourselves, you already know that, or you wouldn't be asking Harold about loopholes right now instead of asking me how I've been feeling these last year and a half." Nobody in that room said anything for almost a full minute. Then Harold Bennett spoke again. The trust condition wasn't met. Per Frank Whitfield's instructions, the full amount, $310,000 for $112, following the coin appraisal and insurance payout, will be transferred to the Millbrook Junction Community Foundation to establish the Frank and Eleanor Whitfield Scholarship Fund. Now, friends, here's where a story like this one could end. And honestly, if it ended right here, it would already be a satisfying kind of justice, wouldn't it? 3 adult children, who sold their mother's home out from under her and tucked her away in the cheapest facility they could find, learning that their greed cost them everything they were secretly hoping for. But this story has a second half, and I think it might be the better half, because word travels fast in a town like Millbrook Junction. And within about 3 weeks of that meeting in Harold Bennett's office, most of the town knew the broad strokes of what had happened, not because Eleanor or Margaret gossiped about it, but because Denise, in a moment of bitterness, complained about it loudly enough at the local hair salon that it spread the old-fashioned way, one conversation at a time. The reaction from the town was not kind to Richard, Denise, or Michael. People who'd known Eleanor for decades. People who remembered her potato salad, her 4th of July barbecues, the way she'd shown up with a casserole for every single family in that town who'd ever lost someone or had a baby or gotten sick, did not take kindly to learning how her own children had treated her. Meanwhile, Tom and Sarah Reyes, the young couple who'd found the note in the first place, reached out to Eleanor through Harold Bennett. They wanted to meet her. They wanted to thank her, somehow, though they weren't entirely sure for what. And more than that, Sarah said, they wanted her to know that whatever happened, the farmhouse was still loved, still cared for. Their baby, due that winter, was going to grow up in the same rooms where Eleanor had raised her own children. Eleanor visited the farmhouse for the first time in over a year, 3 weeks after that meeting. Tom and Sarah invited her for Sunday dinner, and something about that detail, a Sunday dinner, in that house, made Eleanor cry before she'd even gotten out of the car. She walked through rooms that were unmistakably hers and unmistakably new at the same time. Sarah had kept the kitchen's original cabinets, refinished rather than replaced. The living room still had the same window that faced the sunset, the one Eleanor used to sit by every evening with Frank. And out back, the well, now properly resealed with a small brass plaque Tom had installed, reading simply, "For Frank and Eleanor. Some things are worth protecting." Eleanor sat on that back porch that evening, watching the same sunset she'd watched for over 50 years of her life, surrounded by two young strangers who had, in the space of a single dinner, treated her with more warmth and genuine curiosity about her life than her own children had shown in the previous 18 months combined. "You're welcome here any time," Tom told her as she left that night. "This is your porch too, as far as we're concerned." What happened over the following months surprised everyone, including Eleanor herself. Tom and Sarah began inviting her out to the farmhouse regularly. First once a month, then every other week. Then, once their daughter was born that winter, almost every Sunday. Eleanor, who had spent her whole life as the one who fed everyone else, found herself, in her final chapter, being fed, cared for, and included by two people who owed her absolutely nothing. She held their baby girl, whom they named Frances. Sarah told Eleanor, with tears in her eyes, that it was a quiet nod to Frank, even though they'd of course chosen the more common spelling. Margaret, naturally, remained a constant, and slowly, a new kind of family took shape around Eleanor. Not the family she'd given birth to, but a family made of people who simply, consistently, chose to show up. Cedar Grove Manor staff noticed the change in her too. One nurse told Margaret that Eleanor seemed, for the first time since she'd arrived, like a woman with something to look forward to each week, rather than a woman quietly enduring the time she had left. The scholarship fund, meanwhile, awarded its first grant the following fall, $4,000 to a local high school senior named Priya Patel, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs, headed off to study nursing at Ohio State. Eleanor was invited to the small ceremony at the high school, and when Priya thanked her personally, not knowing the full story behind the fund, just knowing it was named for Frank and Eleanor Whitfield, community members, Eleanor said only, "Frank would have liked you very much." As for Richard, Denise, and Michael, their relationship with their mother didn't end entirely, but it changed permanently into something quieter, more distant, more formal. They visited less, if you can imagine that being possible, whether that was shame or resentment or simple avoidance of a truth they didn't want to keep confronting. Eleanor never said for certain, and frankly, by that point in the story, she had stopped waiting for them to explain themselves. Friends, before we get to how this story truly ends, I want to know, do you think Eleanor's children ever really understood what they lost? Not the money. I mean the relationship, the trust, the version of their mother's final years they could have had if they'd simply shown up. Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. Eleanor Whitfield passed away peacefully 2.5 years after the well was discovered, at 81 years old, in a hospice room with a window that, this time, she made sure of it herself, looked directly out onto open sky. Margaret was there. Tom and Sarah were there, 3-year-old Frances asleep in Sarah's arms. Harold Bennett came by that final week too, just to sit with her a while, the way an old friend does. Richard, Denise, and Michael were also there in the final days, and to their credit, whatever complicated mixture of grief and guilt brought them to that bedside, they did come. Eleanor, by all accounts, was gracious with them at the end. She held their hands. She told them she loved them, because she did. Love, it turns out, doesn't require someone to have earned it, even when trust and respect certainly do. At her funeral, held at the same small church where she'd married Frank 56 years earlier. The pews were full of people from Millbrook Junction who remembered her casseroles, her kindness, her 50 years of Sunday dinners that never once got canceled. Tom Reyes gave a short, unplanned eulogy, standing up simply because he felt he had to. He talked about a woman who'd sat on his back porch, held his daughter, and taught him more about grace in 2.5 years than he'd learned from almost anyone else in his life. The scholarship fund, as of the making of this video, has now put 6 young people from Millbrook Junction through college who otherwise couldn't have afforded it. Every single one of them has learned, at some point during their studies, the full story of Frank and Eleanor Whitfield, and the children who chose money over their mother. And every single one of them, when asked, has said the same thing. They hope, when they're old, someone remembers them the way this town remembers Eleanor. Friends, I think the reason this story has stayed with me, and I hope it stays with you too, isn't really about the money in that well at all. It never was. It's about the fact that Frank Whitfield understood something so many of us learn only late in life, if we're lucky enough to learn it at all, that the people who deserve what we've built aren't necessarily the ones with our blood in their veins. They're the ones who show up, week after week, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. Eleanor didn't get the ending she deserved from her own children. But she got something else, a found family, a scholarship in her and Frank's names that will outlive every single person in this story, and a final chapter of her life that, against every odd, ended up being surrounded by more genuine love than the years right before it ever were. If this story moved you even a little bit, I would be so grateful if you'd take just a moment to hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss next week's story, because I promise you, we've got more coming that will sit with you just like this one did. And before you go, down in the comments, I want to know, what's the one thing you took away from Eleanor and Frank's story today? Was it about family? About showing up? About what really matters at the end of a long life? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, friends. Take care of the people who show up for you. And I'll see you in the next one.